Thank you for allowing me to be here with you all tonight. It feels like a great treat, and Reverend Lien and I have a lot of fun. We're getting to work together on this Dharma of Being Anti-Racist project with Spirit Rock. So it's a great treat to be here with you all. I'm realizing I'm the closing talk on this book, The First Free Women, is my understanding, which may be disappointing since you all are getting ready to talk about Be the Refuge, Chen Xing's book, which I am also excited to read. And I know this is usually framed as like talking and then Q&A, but I actually would love to start off the talk just hearing a little bit from you all as folks who have been in a process with this book, The First Free Women. It was actually a few weeks ago when Reverend Lien invited me to speak on this, and it was just that week when I'd started to hear the online buzz that there were some deep questions about this book. Is it a translation or not? Like, what does it mean to have this white guy be doing some interpretive poems from Asian nuns 2,600 years ago? So I'd love to just hear from a few people who've been following along with this arc of study. Like, where are you at with this book? And I would love just to hear the whole thing. Like, how did you feel when you first started reading it? How did you feel when you heard critiques about this not really being a translation, and how are you feeling about it now? If anybody would be up for sharing, I think it would help guide some of where we're going tonight.
And feel free to share because I won't include the Q&A in the.
Yeah, thank you for confirming that. And you can give me the, like, what, doesn't have to be pretty. Well, I appreciate people sharing a little bit about where the feeling is at this moment. And I think it will help guide some of our thinking about this particular poem that Reverend Lien and I had looked at originally, which is Dhira, called Self-Reliant, in this particular book. And we'll actually look across both Maddie Weingast's interpretation, interpretive dance version of the poem, as Michelle says, and another translation of the poem, so that we could actually look at those and how they relate to each other. And one of the things I will invite us to look at is that through the analysis of the poem, to even just be thinking about how is it that we are relating to the book, and how can we investigate how, the book is the same, the book has not changed, but how can our relationship with the book change based on our knowledge, our feelings, our information that we have about the book, and our perceptions about it. This is some of the investigation tonight. So more to come. So we could look at this poem a number of ways. I mean, we could try to look at this poem in the Pali version. I'll put it in the chat. I don't know if anyone has good Pali translation skills in this crew. I know I do not, but we can put it in here. Like, this is the level that we could try to look at this poem. Dire Nirodam Pusahe Sanya Vupasamam Sukham Ara Dayahi Nibanam Yoga Kemam Anuttaram. We can look at it at that level and try to understand what this means and what is happening. maybe I said half of that correctly, even though, you know, so if we don't know language and we don't know pronunciation, it's hard to work at this level. And so we're going to try to look at a couple of a translation level and through this interpretive level of Maddie Weingast. But even if we're looking at a more accepted translation that sticks more literally to this version in Pali, I think anyone who speaks more than one language knows that there's never really a one-to-one match for words and meaning. You know, that's true even in modern day languages, but certainly if you're working across ancient Pali and modern day English, it's a wide range. One example that we talk about a lot in my lineage of Buddhism is translating, how hard it is to translate this really core word of sati that we translate into mindfulness. Because in English, we think about heart and mind as separate things. And in Pali, heart and mind are all one field. And so because they're conceptually distinct in those languages, translation becomes almost impossible. We lose a lot in translation. The connotation is not actually the same. So we'll do our best looking at the translation. And then there's this poetry that Maddie Weingast has offered us. And, you know, sometimes it might just feel like this is just trash. We could throw this out. It's maybe not useful to us. But I know for me, one of the things when I first started looking at hearing about the controversy that was arising, I actually looked at the long list of teachers who had offered praise for the book and saw a lot of Dharma teachers that I respected who had read the book and found value in it. And so it certainly slowed me down to at least be like, what is in this book that people have found useful and valuable, whatever it is that's in this book, whether I would call it a translation or something else. Is there some doorway to liberation that is useful here? And in particular, like, as I think about slowing down some of the critique that is here, if I've noticed that there are a couple of gender nuances that for me feel a little present in the ways that the book is being critiqued that I haven't really heard people name or take care around. And I felt curious to explore this with you all. And in doing so, I want to name pretty explicitly that I'm not actually that interested in defending Maddie Weingast. That's not actually what I'm up to do, because the more I read about what the book is and what he's done, I agree that it feels really important and essential to distinguish what he wrote as something different than translation. So I just want to feel clear about that. And there's something in the energy of the call out that I also feel like it might be helpful to slow down. That there's something in the shadow of the critique that might be helpful to be attuned to. So what am I talking about? One, I definitely feel pretty irritated by the race dynamics of a white dude writing and rewriting Asian nun poems. Like, that's really pretty annoying. But it's been interesting because at least the people that I see online who are most angry about this are white people, and particularly white women. And that's, I see some people laughing. And so it can be a bit of a red flag for me just to double check my own intentions about that anger. because certainly it's part of my work as a white anti-racist person to speak out against injustice, but it's also part of my work to double check saviorism. And the academic Gayatri Spivak describes this in colonial context as white women trying to save brown women from brown men. But in this case, it's like white women saving brown women from white men, like getting kind of obsessed about that work. So it's just something that I'm tracking and trying to pay attention to, is like who's actually the angriest about this, and what else is that anger representing? Not saying that's the only anger here, because certainly there's other anger that's part of this, but when that's a big piece of the anger, I have a question. The other anger that I then notice also is that I have felt curious about how many monastic voices are critiquing the project, that has been this deep communication with this very particular set of American Theravada Buddhist nuns. Reverend Lien, you mentioned that the particular set of nuns who were in relationship with this project were Ayya Ananda Bodhi and the nuns she's affiliated with in the Thai forest tradition. And I don't know if folks know the history of these Buddhist nuns, but I think of them as folks who can be seen as outcasts in relationship to more strict monastic orders. So here's the history if you don't know it. So in Theravada Buddhist traditions across Thailand and Sri Lanka, the order of bhikkhunis, the lineage of nuns, actually died out over 1,000 years ago. And in the strictest reading of the rules for monks and nuns, there was then no formal way to reestablish the lineage. If there were no nuns, no new nuns could be ordained because there was nobody to do it. Nuns had to do it. And so it was only 25 years ago that the bhikkhuni lineage was revived, when 10 nuns were ordained by Sri Lankan monks. And the Thai tradition has actually been much more strict. And it was in 2009 when Ajahn Brahm ordained bhikkhunis to practice in Australia and in Northern California. And by doing this, he was actually kicked out of his Thai forest lineage for this action. And so Maddie Weingast's partners in this book are not just any Buddhist nuns. They're actually, Ayya Ananda Bodhi was actually ordained in 2011 within this lineage of Thai forest nuns who are outcasts within the larger monastic field. So it just, again, like, it just makes me at least slow down and ask some questions and think a little bit about the precarious positionality of Ayya Ananda Bodhi and other nuns in her community, and just wonder how her position as an outsider impacts people's really quick and fierce critique of this work. And again, like, I'm not trying to say that this book needs to be identified as something different than a translation, but I do feel curious. I know for me, like when my anger like escalates to something much bigger and really big, like I always want to scan for what other feelings and impulses might be stacked onto that feeling that might actually be about something different. So this brings us back to Dhira, the poem that we wanted to study tonight. And I'm going to put a couple of translations in the chat for us to look at together. the first translation at the top from Samanera Mahindra is short. It's more directly translated from Pali. It says, contact cessation, O Dhira, appeasing of perceptions is happiness. Attain nibbana or nirvana, the unsurpassed refuge from fetters. So in this translation, we're getting pointed to how to contact freedom, how to contact cessation of suffering. So you might be familiar with this layout of teaching already, but I just want to break down this phrase, appeasing of perceptions. This is this word sanya in Pali, perceptions, which when I see the word perceptions written, it points to a whole host of teachings about the 5 aggregates, which to me helps me understand how I'm relating to something and how I'm relating something, breaking it down into 5 component parts. And since we're studying our relationship with this book, this whole book of Maddie Weingast's book, The Free Women, The First Free Women, we can actually use this book as an example of something we're relating to in these 5 parts. So 1, this book is made up of form or matter. It's got a cover, it's got pages made out of paper, it's got ink on it. It's made up of materials. 2, something that helps us understand our relationship to the book is what's our feeling about it. That's maybe changed over time, but you could break it down to pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. 3, and this is the one that the poem is talking about, is perception. Sometimes I could think about it also as labeling. There's a lot of labels you could give this book. You might say that it's if you have a copy of the book, it's got a beige cover with, so you could label the color of the book. You might also name or label your emotion about the book. If you're angry at the book, that could be a perception that you have about the book. This 4th one gets a little more complicated. Mental formations or conditioned things. And this in some ways is part of what I just tried to talk through, is that there's often some other kind of residual or past conditioning that can shape our perceptions before we even come into contact with the book. In this case, it potentially shapes why we're angry about the book, and it can be helpful to articulate that clearly to understand how we're relating to the book. And the 5th piece, to break out consciousness, or I think of it as sense contact, is that we have 6 sense doors for relating to the book: our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our body, and our mind. So we can get information about the book from any of those points of consciousness. I guess you could like taste it if you wanted to. Maybe not the best sense door for a book, but perhaps it has good information. So those 5 aggregates can be a useful thing to break down anytime you're trying to break down how you're relating to something. And Dhira is giving us an idea to also keep it simple and say that the more that we ease up on our labeling of perception, the more happiness that we can have. But that's a straightforward lens to freedom. So how did Maddie Weingast give us an interpretive dance about that? So he says, also in the chat here, look closely, my heart. See how all things arise and pass away, even that which is turning the shapes on this page into sounds and thoughts you are right now silently speaking to yourself. When you no longer need to read the signs to find your way, you'll know for yourself that books and maps can only get you so far. There is a direct path. So I actually find his imagery, this line, the shapes on this page, to be a really powerful way to distinguish among the aggregates, that the form of the ink and the perception that we have of a particular word that we learned how to read in English, and the mental formation that can happen when these words then collide with the historical connotations that we apply to them based on our personal experiences, that those all are actually different things. He also kind of pushes us there in that poem to be attuned to our forms of consciousness or sense contact. That there's a lot there at play when we read. Is it just through our eyes? Is it something we hear through our ears if we're whispering quietly to ourselves? Does our experience of reading change if it's an input through different points of contact? How does it land in this point of contact in the mind, in our thoughts? So he is inviting in the same set of thinking. And as we're reading, like I really invite you to stay in touch with your own feelings about this poem, which get to be totally different than mine. You can still be real annoyed with him. Completely. Or be loving this poem completely or something else. But what I want us to pay attention to is how something so seemingly benign as shapes on this page can evoke such a range of emotion. And I think this is an essential teaching, that even before we see the shapes on the page, we could actually show up with a story about who wrote them and what they are about and how we're going to allow ourselves to be impacted by them. That can all be present before we even see the shapes on the page. And we felt that change over time in our relationship with this book. Like, we first had a story about who these words were from, that they were going to be told to us most directly from liberated Asian Buddhist nuns. And now we might have a different story about how it's some white dude faking it. The shapes on the page have not moved. But our perception of them as positive, negative, or neutral may have shifted, might be shifting again, might shift some more. And I think this is a deep lesson of the Buddha, that what our eyes come into contact with, what our senses come into contact with, the shapes on the page are never some kind of pure information out there, that those shapes will always be based on and informed by stories that we have already internally about what the book is. So it's really important to feel that and know that, and that doesn't just happen when you have some white dude overreaching about what gets named as translation. That actually is happening all of the time with everything that our senses come into contact with. It can get a little overwhelming when you try to think that that's happening all the time. And so I appreciate that, you know, towards the end of the poem, the reminder is that in this practice towards liberation, that that books and maps, they only get you so far. And certainly his book is only going to get us so far. So I'm glad that you're putting it down for now, picking it up again when it's the right thing to pick up. Reading Chenzing's book, which is what I've read so far, is excellent. Yeah, and just I think really returning again to this piercing clarity from Dhira to really practice with appeasing of perception. That anytime I think I know what something is named or labeled, is there space to leave that up for consideration? And can I notice how that offers me some measure of freedom? So I will close there and give us a little more space for Q&A before we close. I can wrap up with a dedication of merit. Yeah, I just invite you to notice what is here in your field of awareness tonight as we close. Could be a mix of emotions, seeing if there's anything here that feels of benefit. Letting that land more fully with you. And letting it expand from there. As anything that has impacted you now has an opportunity to influence the world around you. And may this merit that we have generated here tonight have the capacity, the opportunity to bring greater liberation to all beings.